Hello, my name is Joshua Montgomery, 38 years old. I am the governor of the state of Oregon, but don't rush to assume that I was born into this seat of power or that I grew up basking in the glow of fame. No, my path to this point was anything but paved with roses. It was filled with scars, sleepless nights, and arguments that felt like they were tearing my heart apart. If you ask me what brought me to where I am today, I'd say it's faith. Faith in a cleaner world, a better future, and perhaps faith that I could stand firm against my own family. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a sprawling mansion perched atop a hill, overlooking the shimmering Willamette River at sunset. From the outside, the Montgomery family home looked like a palace, white marble columns, towering glass windows, and a meticulously tended garden bursting with vibrant red roses. But inside it was as cold as a block of ice. That was where I learned that money and power never equate to happiness. My family was a dynasty, a name known throughout Portland, Montgomery. We owned Montgomery Industries, a mining and mineral processing conglomerate specializing in copper and lithium, commodities hotter than ever due to the electric vehicle boom. But behind the staggering profit margins were rivers clouded with chemicals, encroached forests, and communities living in fear for their health. I realized this at a very young age, but my father, Edward Montgomery, did not. To him, the environment was merely an obstacle, something to be swept aside to keep the money flowing into the vault. My father was a formidable man, tall and imposing, with salt and pepper hair and eyes as sharp and cold as steel. He always wore impeccably tailored suits paired with a gleaming gold watch on his wrist. But it wasn't his commanding appearance that scared me most. It was his voice, deep, steady, and unyielding, allowing no room for dissent. "Profit is everything, Joshua," he would say, holding a glass of whiskey, his eyes fixed on me as if I were a failed project. "If you want to succeed, learn to put profit above emotions." My mother, Eleanor, was the complete opposite. She was gentle with golden blonde hair and eyes as blue as Crater Lake on a summer day. She loved me, I knew that, but her love was always caught between me and my father. Whenever I clashed with him, she would sit there, hands clasped tightly, eyes filled with worry. She wanted to protect me, but she was afraid of angering my father. "Joshua, be patient with your father," she would whisper when it was just the two of us. "He only wants what's best for you." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew that my father's version of best wasn't what I wanted. And then there was Matthew, my younger brother. 4 years my junior, Matthew was the center of attention from the moment he was born. With his dark brown hair and arrogant smile, he was a perfect replica of our father. Ambitious, aggressive, and never one to prioritize others' interests above his own. My father doted on Matthew, calling him the ideal heir. Matthew knew it and seized every opportunity to prove he was better than me. "You're a failure, Josh," he'd say, his smirk dripping with contempt. "You think you can change the world by saving a few trees? Wake up." I didn't blame Matthew for how he treated me. He was only following what our father taught him, that money was the measure of success and the weak were those who couldn't make it. But every time I heard his mocking words, my heart ached. Not because I craved his respect, but because I knew deep down he was just another victim of our father's warped mindset. The conflict between me and my family began when I was young, but it erupted when I was 15. One summer afternoon, I accompanied my father to a copper mine owned by the company on the outskirts of Portland. I still remember the acrid smell of chemicals in the air, the murky water flowing from the factory, and the weary eyes of the local residents. "Dad, what are we doing to this river?" I asked, my voice trembling. He just laughed, patting my shoulder as if I'd told a joke. "That's the price of progress, Joshua. You'll understand when you grow up." But I didn't understand, and I didn't want to. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. I read about rivers poisoned by industrial waste, forests razed to make way for mines, and children in towns near the mines falling ill from contaminated water. Every time I tried to talk to my father about it, he brushed me off. "You're too sensitive," he'd say. "The world doesn't run on emotions." My childhood years passed in endless arguments. Every dinner at the Montgomery Mansion was a battlefield. I tried to explain that we could mine more sustainably, that new technologies could reduce pollution. But my father looked at me with disappointment while Matthew sneered, calling me a delusional dreamer. My mother, as always, remained silent, her hands gripping her napkin tightly. The breaking point came when I was 17. My father wanted me to study business at Harvard, where he had gone to eventually take over Montgomery Industries. "That's your path, Joshua," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "You were born to carry on this company's legacy." But I didn't want that. I couldn't imagine myself sitting in a lavish office, signing contracts that would continue to poison the river where I used to fish as a child. Instead, I chose the University of Oregon, home to the state's best environmental science program. That decision was the final straw. My father summoned me to his study, where he sat behind his oak desk with our family portrait hanging on the wall. "You're betraying this family," he said, his voice icy. "If you choose this path, don't expect a single cent from me." I stood there, my heart pounding, but I didn't back down. "I don't need your money," I replied, knowing full well I was setting myself on a treacherous path. "I'll manage on my own." My mother cried when I left home. She hugged me tightly, whispering that she would always love me, but I knew she couldn't do more. Matthew, of course, didn't miss the chance to mock me. "Good luck with your plants, Josh," he said, his smile laced with malice. "Don't come crawling back when you fail." I left the Montgomery Mansion with a backpack, a few $100s in savings, and a dream bigger than the Cascade Mountains. I didn't know if I could change the world, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't live a life where I had to look in the mirror every day and feel ashamed. Leaving the Montgomery Mansion felt like stepping out of a gilded prison. No more suffocating dinners under my father's disappointed gaze. No more of Matthew's razor-sharp taunts. But freedom always comes with a price. On my first day at the University of Oregon, I stood in front of the ivy-covered red brick dormitory, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Eugene, where the university was located, was a small town with tree-lined streets and crisp, clean air, a far cry from Portland's glitz. But I quickly realized that without my father's money, college life was anything but easy. Tuition, textbooks, rent, all of them weighed on my shoulders like boulders. I applied for scholarships, but they only covered a fraction of the costs. So I started working, taking any job I could find. My first job was waiting tables at a cozy little cafe near campus called the Green Bean. The place smelled of freshly roasted coffee, and its walls were adorned with paintings of Oregon's forests. I worked from early morning to late afternoon, my feet aching, but the customers' smiles and their stories of hiking trails or beloved rivers made it worthwhile. "You're an environmental science student, aren't you?" An elderly man with silver hair asked me once as I wiped down a table. "Good for you. Oregon needs people like you." Those small words of encouragement were the light that guided me through the tough days. But waiting tables wasn't enough to cover everything. I took on a part-time job as an environmental research assistant for a professor at the university, Dr. Clara Hensley. She was a petite woman with her hair tied up in a bun, but her passion for ecosystems was boundless. "Joshua, the environment isn't something we own," she told me during our first meeting. "It's something we borrow from future generations." I worked in her lab, analyzing water samples from rivers near mining sites, and each result hit me like a punch to the gut. Toxic chemical levels off the charts, mass fish die-offs, soil contaminated with heavy metals. Those numbers weren't just data, they were nature's cries for help, and I was determined to listen. My college years were an endless cycle. Study, work, sleep, if I was lucky, a few hours. Some nights I stayed in the library until the security guard knocked to signal closing time, my eyes burning from reading about land restoration. Some days I survived on peanut butter sandwiches because I couldn't afford anything else. But I didn't complain. Every time I looked out my dorm window and saw the misty Cascade Mountains in the distance, I told myself, "You're doing the right thing. You have to keep going." Meanwhile, my family seemed to have forgotten I existed. My father never called or wrote. Matthew occasionally sent texts, but only to brag. A new Porsche, a trip to Europe, or a lavish party at the mansion. "How's it going, Josh? Still hugging trees?" he'd write, followed by a smirking emoji. I'd read the messages, set the phone down, and not reply. But each of Matthew's words stung like a needle, echoing my father's old refrain. "You're a failure if you don't make money." My mother was the only one who kept in touch. She'd call late at night when my father wasn't home. "Joshua, are you okay?" she'd ask, her voice trembling. I could picture her in the living room, clutching the phone, glancing at the door as if afraid my father might walk in. "I just want you to be settled, sweetheart. Graduate, get a government job, get married, have kids, don't work too hard." I'd smile and tell her I was fine, but the truth was I had no time for love. My mind was consumed with dying rivers, ravaged forests, and a dream of an Oregon untainted by greed. Still, there were moments when loneliness felt suffocating. On rainy nights in Eugene, I'd lie on the narrow bed in my dorm, listening to the rain tap against the window, wondering if I was on the right path. Was it worth it, trading my family and comfort for an ideal my father called fanciful? But the next morning, when I held a sample of clean soil from a restored site or saw a child in a park beaming because they could drink clean water, I knew the answer. It was worth it. All of it was. After graduating from the University of Oregon with a degree in environmental science, I didn't return to Portland. I couldn't face my father or endure Matthew's scornful gaze. Instead, I took a job at a small nonprofit in Bend, Oregon, focused on protecting water resources. The pay was low, the work grueling, but I loved every minute. I traveled across the state, from tiny towns along the Deschutes River to communities near mining sites, talking to residents, collecting data, and fighting to hold companies like Montgomery Industries accountable. One of my first projects was in a small town called Klamath Falls, where a river was heavily polluted by waste from a nearby lithium mine. The locals, mostly farmers and miners, lived in fear for their health. I still remember my first community meeting, standing before a skeptical crowd. "Who are you to tell us what to do?" An older man with a flushed face shouted. "You know we depend on this mine for our livelihoods." I took a deep breath, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm not here to take away your jobs. I'm here to make sure your grandchildren have clean water to drink and clean soil to farm." The room fell silent, and from then on, they started listening. The Klamath Falls project lasted 2 years. I worked day and night, from analyzing water samples to writing reports for the state environmental agency. I met with lawyers, debated with mining company representatives, and organized peaceful protests. There were moments when I was threatened. An anonymous call in the middle of the night, a car tailing me on the highway. But I didn't stop. In the end, the company was forced to install a new waste filtration system, and the river began to recover. The day I saw the first fish swimming back, I sat on the riverbank, tears streaming down my face. Not out of pride in myself, but because I knew I'd done something meaningful. But the success in Klamath Falls was just the beginning. I went on to work for other environmental organizations, leading projects from forest restoration in Rogue Valley to protecting wetlands in Malheur. My reputation grew not because I sought it, but because I never gave up. I became a speaker at environmental conferences, wrote articles for magazines, and appeared on local news. Joshua Montgomery, Oregon's young environmental activist, they called me. But every time I heard the name Montgomery, I thought of my father, his company, and wondered if one day I'd have to confront my own family. My mother called more frequently. She started sending money, small amounts secretly transferred to my account. "Don't tell your father," she'd whisper over the phone. I didn't want to accept it, but I knew she did it out of love, trying to make up for the years she couldn't stand up for me. I used the money for books, gas for field trips, and occasionally a decent cup of coffee. But I never told her what I was doing, never shared my victories or the nights I stayed up under pressure. I was afraid she'd worry, or worse, tell my father. Matthew, on the other hand, never changed. His messages grew rarer, but each one was still laced with venom. "Heard you're working for some Save the World outfit," he wrote once, attaching a photo of himself next to a yacht in Seattle. "Pathetic. Dad says you're the family's disgrace." I read that message in a tiny rental room in Bend, where I lived with a single bed and an old desk. I wanted to reply, to scream that I didn't need his or my father's approval. But I just turned off my phone, took a deep breath, and got back to work. Despite the hardships, those years shaped me. I learned to stand firm under pressure, to talk to people who disagreed with me, and to hold fast to my ideals even when the world seemed against me. I was no longer the trembling boy standing before my father in his study. I was a man with a mission, and I knew that even if my family turned their backs on me, I would keep going. But I never imagined that my mission would lead me to the governor's seat of Oregon. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I would be leading a state, I would have laughed and told them to stop dreaming. I was just a guy chasing a dream of protecting rivers and forests, not a politician with polished speeches or calculated handshakes. But life, as I've learned, has a way of guiding you to places you never anticipated. It all started in Bend, after the victory in Klamath Falls. The river restoration project there didn't just save a water source, it restored faith in an entire community. The news spread quickly. Local papers dubbed me an environmental mentor, a title that made me both proud and uneasy. I didn't want to be a mentor. I just wanted to do what was right. But my reputation grew, and with it came invitations from all corners: environmental conferences, university talks, and even meetings with government officials. One autumn afternoon in 2023, as I sat in my small office in Bend reading a report on soil contamination in Rogue Valley, my phone rang. It was Sarah Hyland, a freelance journalist and a friend I'd known since my days at the University of Oregon. "Joshua, have you ever thought about running for office?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Run for office? Me?" "Sarah, I'm an activist, not a politician." But Sarah didn't laugh. "Listen," she said. "The people of Oregon admire you. You've done things politicians only promise to do. This state needs someone like you." Sarah's words echoed in my mind for days. I didn't like politics, the empty gestures, the fake handshakes, the backroom deals. But I also knew that real change needed power. Not the kind of power to control, but to protect the rivers, the forests, and the communities harmed by pollution from corporations like my father's Montgomery Industries. I spent weeks deliberating. I walked along the Deschutes River watching salmon swim upstream and wondered if I had the strength to enter a world I'd always despised. But then I thought of the children in Klamath Falls, the farmers who lost land to pollution, and the forests ravaged by greed. If I didn't step up, who would? So at the age of 37, I decided to run for governor of Oregon in 2024. It was a crazy decision, and I knew I was up against seasoned politicians backed by millions in corporate funding. I had no money, no connections, and the Montgomery name, once my family's pride, was now a burden, as everyone knew my father's company was one of the environment's biggest adversaries. My campaign started humbly. My office was a small room in an old Portland building, furnished with folding tables and a handful of volunteers, students, environmental activists, and ordinary people I'd met through past projects. We didn't have much money, but we had belief. I traveled across the state, from small towns like Ashland to big cities like Salem, talking to people about what I'd seen. Dying rivers, vanishing forests, and broken promises. "I'm not promising you a perfect world," I said in every speech, "but I'm promising to fight for a cleaner Oregon, for our children." The first weeks were tough. My opponents attacked relentlessly, calling me an unrealistic idealist, an inexperienced upstart. a traitor to my tycoon family. Some articles even dredged up my past, mentioning how my father cut me off for refusing to follow the business path. But each criticism only made me more determined. I didn't need their approval. I needed the people's trust. Then something miraculous happened. People who'd heard me speak in Klamath Falls, Rogue Valley, and Malheur started showing up at my rallies carrying homemade signs. Joshua for clean water. Green Oregon, strong Oregon. Environmental organizations, from big ones like the Sierra Club to small local groups, began endorsing me. College students, young and passionate, became the backbone of my campaign, handing out flyers, posting on social media, and organizing fundraising concerts. "You're making history, Joshua," Sarah told me one night as we ate pizza in the office after a long day. I smiled, but inside I just hoped I wouldn't let them down. On election day, I barely slept. I stood in my small Portland apartment looking out at the Willamette River, wondering if all this effort was worth it. The results came in late that night, in a packed hall. When the announcer read my name, Joshua Montgomery, the new governor of Oregon, the room erupted in applause. I stood there, heart pounding, unable to believe my ears. At 38, I became the youngest governor in Oregon's history, winning overwhelmingly thanks to the support of ordinary people. On Inauguration Day, I stood before the Oregon State Capitol in Salem under a gray January sky and took the oath. I wore a simple suit, not a tailored one like my father's. And in my speech I said, "I don't promise to please everyone, but I promise to work every day to protect Oregon's land, water, and air. Not just for us, but for generations to come." The crowd cheered, but I knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Being governor wasn't what I expected. My office in Salem was a spacious room with windows overlooking a park, but I rarely had time to enjoy the view. Every day was a blur of meetings, reports, and debates. I pushed for strict environmental policies, requiring mining companies like Montgomery Industries to install advanced waste filtration systems, raising taxes on polluting activities, and investing in renewable energy. These policies won public support but made me a target for big corporations and conservative politicians. I still remember my first meeting with mining industry executives. They sat across from me in a sleek conference room dressed in expensive suits, their eyes cold. "Governor Montgomery," one of them, an older man with a gravelly voice, said, "We understand you want to protect the environment, but these policies will kill our industry. Do you know how many jobs are at stake?" I looked him in the eye and replied, "I do. But I also know how many people are getting sick from polluted water, how much land is being destroyed. If you don't change, I'll make sure the law forces you to." My words silenced the room. I knew I'd made more enemies, but I didn't care. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to do what was right. Meanwhile, my family remained a shadow in my life. My father and Matthew didn't know I was governor. They never cared about my career, never read the news, never watched TV. My mother, though she still called, only asked about my health and urged me to settle down. I didn't tell her about my new role, not because I didn't want to, but because I feared she'd tell my father and I wasn't ready to face him. But fate didn't give me a choice. One morning, my mother called, her voice brimming with excitement. "Joshua, will you come to my 60th birthday?" she asked. "I really want the whole family together, just this once." I hesitated. Returning to the Montgomery mansion meant facing my father, Matthew, and all the old wounds. But I couldn't refuse her. "I'll come," I said, though inside I knew that party wouldn't just be a reunion. It would be a battle, one I couldn't avoid. As I prepared for the visit, I learned that Montgomery Industries was under investigation for violating the new environmental standards I'd enacted. Part of me wanted to halt the investigation, not to protect my father, but because I feared it would tear the family apart. But then I remembered the murky rivers, the devastated forests, and the sick children. I couldn't back down. I was Joshua Montgomery, governor of Oregon, and I would do what was right, even if it meant confronting my own flesh and blood. The day I drove back to Portland, my heart felt heavy. I knew that at my mother's birthday party, everything would change. My father and Matthew would have to face the truth that I was no longer the failure they once mocked. And for the first time, I would confront them not as a son or a brother, but as a man who had found his own path. That day, I wore a simple navy suit, not the tailored kind my father or Matthew favored. In my pocket was a small box containing my gift for my mother, a silver necklace with a sapphire pendant, the color of Crater Lake, which she once said she loved. I hoped the gift would bring a smile to her face, even if just for a moment. But deep down, I knew that smile wouldn't last when I faced my father and Matthew. As I turned onto the road leading to the Montgomery mansion, my heart pounded. The house appeared as grand as ever in my memory. White marble columns, towering glass windows reflecting the glow of lanterns, and a garden of vibrant red roses under soft light. But it was no longer my home. It was an arena, and I was a gladiator without a weapon. I parked beside a row of luxury cars, Bentleys, Mercedes, Rolls-Royces, symbols of the elite world my father always prided himself on. A tuxedoed valet opened my car door, bowing. "Welcome, Mr. Montgomery," he said, his eyes flickering with surprise, as if he hadn't expected me to show up. I gave a faint smile and stepped into the grand foyer where the light from a crystal chandelier glowed like a moon. Inside, the air buzzed with festivity. A string quartet played in the corner, their violins blending with the chatter and laughter of high society guests, CEOs, politicians, judges, lawyers, and those my father called strategic partners. They wore expensive suits and evening gowns, holding sparkling glasses of wine. I felt out of place, like a salmon swimming upstream in an unfamiliar ocean. My mother was the first to see me. She stood near the banquet table wearing a pale green silk dress, her golden hair swept up. When her eyes met mine, her face lit up. "Joshua," she called, her voice trembling with emotion. She hurried over, wrapping me in a tight embrace, her familiar jasmine perfume stirring a pang in my chest. "You came," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "I was afraid you wouldn't." "I couldn't miss your special day," I said, handing her the gift box. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and when she saw the necklace, she smiled, a smile tinged with sadness. "You remembered I love blue," she said, her voice catching. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but then I saw my father approaching. Edward Montgomery was just as I remembered, tall, commanding, with salt and pepper hair and piercing cold eyes. He wore a black suit, his gold watch glinting on his wrist. But something was different. Deeper lines around his eyes, a slightly slower gait. Time had touched him, but it hadn't softened his presence. "Joshua," he said, his voice deep but devoid of warmth. "I didn't expect you to come." "I'm here for Mom," I replied, keeping my tone steady. My father studied me, his gaze probing, as if trying to gauge how I'd changed after years apart. But before he could say more, Matthew appeared like a gust of toxic wind. "Well, look who's here," Matthew said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. My brother looked like a younger version of our father. Dark brown hair swept back, a fitted gray suit, and that familiar smirk. He sauntered over, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes gleaming with malice. "The tree-hugging hero himself? What's with the cheap look, Josh? Still picking up trash in parks?" A few nearby guests chuckled, but their laughter faded when I met Matthew's gaze. "Hello, Matthew," I said evenly. "You look well. How's work at the company?" I knew the question would hit a nerve, as I'd heard Montgomery Industries was struggling with the new environmental regulations I'd enacted. Matthew's brow furrowed, but before he could retort, my mother took my arm, pulling me aside. "Don't mind Matthew," she whispered. "Today is my day. I just want the family to get along." I nodded, but inside I knew harmony was impossible. The party continued, but I felt like I was walking through a minefield. Every eye in the room seemed to watch me, some curious, some disdainful. I tried to blend in, making small talk with a few guests, but my mind was on my father and Matthew. They didn't know I was the governor of Oregon. They still saw me as the failure they'd mocked. Part of me wanted to keep my secret to avoid conflict, but I knew the truth would erupt sooner or later. That moment came faster than I expected. As everyone sat down for dinner in the grand dining room with its white porcelain plates and gleaming silverware, my father stood, raising his glass of wine. "Thank you all for joining us to celebrate Eleanor's birthday," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "The Montgomery family has always been proud of its achievements, and today we also welcome Joshua's return, though he's chosen a different path." A few guests laughed and Matthew smirked, looking at me like I was a joke. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting to stay calm. But then Matthew stood, clearly unwilling to miss his chance. "Allow me to say a few words," he said, his voice smug. "Our dear Joshua, as Dad said, has taken a very unique path. While we've been building the Montgomery Empire, he's been busy hugging trees, picking up trash, and doing jobs that, let's face it, lead nowhere. Right, Josh?" The room erupted in louder laughter, each chuckle slicing into my heart. I looked at my mother, who bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly. I looked at my father, sipping his wine, his face impassive. And I looked at Matthew, his arrogant smile burning into me. Part of me wanted to stand and walk out, never to return. But then I thought of the rivers I'd saved, the communities I'd protected, and the people of Oregon who'd trusted me. I wasn't a failure. And it was time they knew it. Before I could stand, another voice cut through the room. "Excuse me, may I say something?" It was Judge Richard Harlan, an elderly man with silver hair and a warm, steady voice. A longtime friend of my father's, he was one of the most powerful guests in the room. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. He stood, raising his glass, and looked directly at me. "I think we owe a round of applause to Joshua Montgomery, not because he's Edward's son, but because he's the governor of Oregon, the youngest in history, leading this state with rare integrity." The room seemed to stop breathing. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the table. My father froze, his eyes wide, the first time I'd seen him lose his composure. Matthew stood, mouth agape, his whiskey glass tilting. Guests whispered, their gazes darting from Matthew to me as if unable to believe their ears. My blood surged, but I stood, offering Judge Harlan a faint smile. "Thank you, Judge," I said calmly. "I'm honored, and I also owe you my deepest thanks for your unwavering support during my recent campaign." I glanced at my father, his eyes a storm of confusion and anger. Matthew, after a moment of shock, let out a forced laugh. "Governor? You? This is a joke, right? What kind of scam is this?" He looked around, hoping for agreement, but no one spoke. Judge Harlan sat down, his gaze defiant, as if daring anyone to challenge the truth. My father stood, his voice icy. "Joshua, to my study now." He strode out of the room without waiting for a reply. Every guest watched his exit. The dining room was eerily silent, save for the echo of his footsteps down the hall. My mother clutched my hand, whispering, "Joshua, I didn't know." But I shook my head, signaling I was fine. I knew this was a confrontation I couldn't avoid. I followed him, feeling like I was walking into a lion's den. The study was unchanged. The oak desk, the family portrait on the wall, the scent of old books and faint cigar smoke. My father stood behind the desk, hands braced on the wood, his eyes boring into me. "You're the governor?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Why didn't I know? Were you hiding it from me?" "I didn't hide it," I replied, standing tall. "You never asked. You never cared about my path." My words cut like a knife, and I saw him flinch. But he quickly regained his composure. "Very well," he said, his voice lower. "You're making things difficult for our company. Your policies, they're costing us millions. You can ease them for the family, can't you?" I looked at the man who had once been my entire world, now asking me to betray my principles. "No, Dad," I said firmly. "I'm the governor. I'm here to protect Oregon, not your profits. If Montgomery Industries breaks the law, it will face the consequences." He stared, stunned, as if unable to believe I'd spoken those words. Before he could respond, the study door flew open. Matthew stormed in, his face flushed with rage. "You traitor! Who do you think you are, Governor? You're just a failure trying to ruin this family." "Enough, Matthew." I raised my voice for the first time, startling them both. "I'm not ruining the family. I'm fighting for the rivers your company has poisoned, for the people dying from dirty water. If you think that's betrayal, you don't understand anything." Matthew lunged forward, but my father raised a hand to stop him. "Enough," he said, his voice weary. "Both of you get out." I returned to the dining room where the guests now looked at me differently, a mix of curiosity and respect. Judge Harlan gave me a subtle nod, a silent congratulations. I hugged my mother once more and left the mansion. As I drove away from the tree-lined road, I knew I had closed an old chapter of my life. But ahead lay a new one, full of challenges but also brimming with hope. As I drove away from the Montgomery mansion that night, the lights of Portland faded in my rearview mirror like stars dimming in the distance. I didn't cry, but my heart was heavy. My mother's birthday party wasn't just a reunion, it was a turning point where I confronted my past and declared I would never bow to what I believed was wrong. I had told my father and Matthew that I would hold Montgomery Industries accountable with no leniency. But as my car rolled along I-5, I wondered if I was tearing my family apart or simply protecting what I cherished. 6 months have passed since that fateful night, and my life, like the Willamette River, is both calm and turbulent. As governor, every day brings a new battle. My office in Salem, with its windows overlooking a lush park, has become my second home. Stacks of reports tower high, meetings stretch into the night, and calls from communities across the state remind me that this role is not just about power, it's about responsibility. I don't work for applause. I work for the rivers that once ran murky but now flow clear, for the forests that are regenerating, and for the children in Klamath Falls who can now drink clean water without fear of illness. My environmental policies continue to stir controversy. I've enacted stricter regulations on mining, forcing companies like Montgomery Industries to invest in advanced waste filtration or face hefty fines. I've also championed renewable energy projects, from wind farms in the Columbia Gorge to solar plants in eastern Oregon. The people support me. Polls show my approval ratings at record highs. But big corporations and some politicians see me as a thorn in their side. "Governor Montgomery is killing industry," a conservative newspaper wrote. But I don't care. I know every step I take is for the future, not short-term gain. Montgomery Industries, my father's company, has become a focal point. The investigation I launched before the birthday party uncovered a litany of violations: excessive chemical discharges, unreported environmental impacts, and even bribes to local officials to cover it up. I didn't want to target my family, but I couldn't turn a blind eye. I ordered fines of millions of dollars and mandated the shutdown of a lithium mine in southern Oregon until it complied with new standards. That decision kept me awake many nights. I wondered if I was being too harsh, if there was a way to protect the environment while preserving family ties. But then I thought of the people living near the mine who had lost land and health. I had no other choice. My father didn't call after the party, neither did Matthew. But my mother was different. A week after her birthday, she called, her voice laced with worry. "Joshua, are you okay?" she asked, as always. I could picture her in the living room, clutching the phone, staring out the window. "I'm proud of you, but I'm worried about the family. Your father is furious, and Matthew, he's saying terrible things." I sighed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom, I don't want to hurt anyone, but I have to do what's right. Dad and Matthew need to understand that money can't buy everything." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know, sweetheart. I just hope one day our family can be whole again." I promised to try, but deep down I wasn't sure that was possible. Still, my mother started calling more often. She shared small things, The rose garden she was tending, a book she'd read, a walk by the river. Sometimes she asked about my work and I told her about a restored river or a new conservation area. "You remind me of myself when I was young," she said once, her voice catching. "I used to dream like you, but I wasn't brave enough." Those words made me realize that though she never said it outright, my mother had always supported me in her own way. One spring afternoon, as I was reading a report in my office, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and my heart skipped a beat. It was my father. I hesitated, then answered. "Joshua," he said, his voice deep but no longer icy. "We need to talk." I agreed and we arranged to meet at a small cafe in Portland, a place untainted by the Montgomery mansion's shadow. When I walked into the cafe, my father was already there, wearing a simple dress shirt, no gold watch. He looked older, wearier. We ordered coffee, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't realize how far you'd come," he said, staring at his cup. "I thought you were just a dreamer, but I was wrong." Those words from a man who never admitted fault stunned me. "I don't agree with your methods," he continued, "but I see what you've achieved. The people respect you, and so do I." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to hug him like I did as a child. But another part remembered the years he turned his back, the words that cut like knives. "Thank you, Dad," I said evenly. "But I won't change. Montgomery Industries has to follow the law like every other company." He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "I know," he said. "I just hope we can talk like this." I nodded, and as I left the cafe, I felt a small weight lift, if only slightly. Matthew was a different story. He didn't call or write, but I heard he was trying to change how the company operated. The pressure from my policies forced Montgomery Industries to invest in more sustainable mining technologies. Once I read an interview where Matthew admitted that old methods aren't working anymore. I wasn't sure if it was genuine change or a strategy to save the company, but I held a small hope that Matthew was starting to see the world differently. Meanwhile, I continued leading Oregon with all my heart. I traveled the state, from the dense forests of the Coast Range to the arid plains of the East. I met with people, listened to their stories, and worked to ensure every decision served the long-term good. One of my proudest projects was Green Oregon 2030, a plan to restore 50% of the state's damaged ecosystems by the end of the decade. Standing in a newly replanted forest in Rogue Valley, watching young pines reach for the sunlight, my heart felt lighter. This was why I started and why I kept going. Despite my busy schedule, I remained single. My mother still urged me to settle down, but I laughed and said I wasn't ready. The truth was, I found peace in my work and in simple moments. A morning jog along the Deschutes River, a hot coffee in my office, or an evening writing in my journal, reflecting on Oregon and the future. I didn't need my family's approval or a glamorous life to feel fulfilled. My worth lay in what I'd done for the people in this land. But my family, though I once wanted to disown them, remained part of me. A year after the birthday party, my mother invited me back for dinner. Not a lavish gala, just a family meal. I hesitated but agreed. When I stepped into the mansion, it no longer felt suffocating. My father was there, still stern, but he shook my hand, a gesture I'd never seen from him. Matthew was there too, and though he said little, he didn't mock or taunt. The dinner was awkwardly silent, but my mother smiled throughout, and I knew that though imperfect, this was a first step. As I left the mansion that night, my mother hugged me tightly. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. I looked at her, seeing the lines around her eyes, but also a spark of hope. "I'll always come back, Mom," I said, and this time I knew I meant it. Looking back on my journey, I've realized that success isn't money or power, as my father once taught. It's looking in the mirror without shame, knowing you've lived true to your heart. I haven't changed the world, but I've changed Oregon, one river, one forest, one life at a time. And above all, I've changed myself, from a boy afraid of his father to a man who stands for what he believes. My message, if you care to hear it, is this. Hold fast to your ideals even if the world turns its back. Don't fear being underestimated, don't fear failure, and don't fear walking a path no one understands, because in the end, integrity brings respect, not just from others, but from yourself. And that, above all, is what matters most. I'm still here in the governor's office, looking out at the Willamette River shimmering under the sunset. I don't know what the future holds. Perhaps new challenges, new battles, and maybe one day a truly reconciled family. But I know one thing. I will keep going, like that river, flowing forward, never stopping.